Clearly, Mahler wasn't popular in his own time. Even in his own city of Vienna, you had a problem. I think you go through all of his symphonies, it's very pictorial. And I think we now appreciate that more. And I don't know whether there's a and this might be fanciful, but I don't know whether there's a relationship between, say, the last 50 years being more visual in terms of what we view, and we're always thinking in pictures now, rather than pure sound. And maybe we've learned with Mahler's music to let our imagination run with those pictures. Just in the Fourth Symphony, you have the second movement with the demonic violin, and it conjures up the dance of death. And the First Symphony, which, as I say, had that programmatic element, and Mahler had the picture of a procession of animals at a funeral walking through the forest. But I think you can actually translate that through all of his symphonies, even I think the Seventh Symphony, which people say is the most absolute piece of music that he wrote. But then you get into the Eighth Symphony, and I consider that almost opera in a way. We made a conscious decision very early on when we knew the Mahler years were coming, that we would do all the symphonies and we will do them chronologically. Before we started the cycle, Vasily had done number 5 with us, and then he did number 4 with us. So we're coming now to the central part of the cycle. Symphonies number 4 and 5. And he's already done them with the orchestra. Now, I think it's really interesting to think back on the performances he gave a couple of years ago of these symphonies and about what he's doing with them now. We also heard him do 4 on tour in Spain in the summer. And already that had moved on significantly in the way that he was dramatizing the Fourth Symphony. I think his first interpretation had been really rather classical. It was taking the stance that the Fourth Symphony is Mahler's Mozartian symphony, and he was looking at it in a very classical way. Where he's developing that now is that he's pulling out the strands of drama that are inherent in the piece. So the second movement with the tuned-up violin is becoming more demonic. It's the dance of death. The last movement is becoming more, has a much more gentle and flowing atmosphere to it. And, it really is disappearing off into the distance in the final part of it. And it's those dramatic parts of the symphonies that that he is developing in his interpretation. Vasily's always had the idea that the voice should appear out of the orchestra in the Fourth Symphony. I'm sure that's not new idea, but he feels that very deeply, that he wants the solo to appear, that he wants the music to appear from out of the orchestra, rather than it being somebody who walks on in the middle of a performance, as one often has seen it, as the big soloist. The interpretation is that the voice develops from the previous 3 movements, so that the final movement is a culmination of what's been happening up to that point. So his idea is that you suddenly hear the voice just coming out of the orchestra. He's tried it in different positions. First of all, was absolutely right in front of him. So in certain parts of the audience, you couldn't see there was a soloist there until the soloist actually stood up and started to sing. He's moved them closer to the front. And this week's performance, he's actually, again, the soloist is still within the orchestra, but standing next to the woodwind. And of course, the voice has a lot of key relationships with the woodwind in that final movement. But it's still the idea of that the soloist not being profiled, but that the music coming out, that song coming out of the inside of the orchestra. The Fourth Symphony has a lot of overlapping lines, tunes being melodies, rhythms actually being passed between different parts of the orchestra. And you can analyze the symphony, you can look at how he's constructed it in that way. So there's perhaps a whole polyphonic web in there, but Mahler is also about color. And it's about that, there's also a polyphony of color, which goes through, I think, goes through all his symphonies, but particularly the fourth, because it's so chamber-like. And that voice coming in at the end, yes, it's singing words, and the poem has a very important relevance to the whole idea of the symphony. But it becomes, in one sense, another color that's developed out of the orchestra. And I think that's why I think Vasily sees it in a way that the soloist should be within the orchestra. It becomes another line of color, and in a way, it sort of, as the poem takes you off almost to eternity in that childlike simplicity at the end. Yeah, the Fifth Symphony is a different character altogether. You're talking about chalk and cheese between the fourth and the fifth in many respects. He's moved on. It's the end of that Knabenwunderhorn phase. He's going into something which is intensely dramatic, very personal. I think, in a sense, much more about his life comes within the symphony. And you start with the Funeral March. You start with what people have picked up as the reference to Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. The motivic element that the trumpet speaks at the start is exactly the same as the motivic element in Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. And you almost start to think about the psychological idea of him thinking about the great Beethoven Fifth Symphony. And then you have this Funeral March which progresses through the first movement. And again, Vasily's architecture of the whole symphony is really interesting. It's not just about the first movement. And some interpretations can be almost just about the first movement, and then it goes off to do something else. But he really does, and I'm going to be interested to see how this develops in concert, how he develops his architecture right through to the end of that final movement. And so the context of the movements in between become very interesting. So the famous adagietto, which is taken out of context, has an almost crucial role in the architecture of the symphony. And the pacing of that piece, I believe, is incredibly important. The great Mahler writer, Donald Mitchell, used, when I had a conversation with him about it, he said, it's an adagietto, it's a little adagio. It's not something that needs to be drawn out. And interestingly enough, Mahler's performance was timed at around 7.5 minutes. If that's a true timing, and as far as we know that's correct, you look at some of the late 20th century timings which go up to 11 minutes. And so you think, actually, no, there must be a distortion within that. And I think Vasily's got a clear picture that the adagietto, it's a marvelous movement, it's wonderful string writing and emotional. But it's not the be-all and end-all of the symphony, because you're working from that funereal opening through an immense amount of moods to the adagietto, which is warm and it's tender, but it's very emotional, to almost the final, big rejoicing finale. And I think that's the interesting thing about how Vasily is interpreting the Fifth Symphony. I think interpretation is always very personal, and the composer performing his own works will always have in his mind the idea of how he wanted it to go. But you actually talk to composers and they say, actually, no, I had an idea it went this way, but somebody's convinced me it can also go another way too. So I think there are many more ways you can, particularly with Mahler, where the music is incredibly dramatic, I think extremely pictorial, very fluid, but with a very strong sense of architecture. And you can take those elements and heighten them, any one of those elements. Bernstein used to do it in a particular way. Haitink used to do it in another particular way. We're talking about great Mahler interpreters a few decades ago. The newer generation will look at it in a different way. What I like about Petrenko's is that he does have a personal view of it. And I think also, just like the Fourth, he's drawing out the dramatic points within that, but never losing the whole picture. It's a sort of darkness to light idea from that, you have that funereal march. It's very dark. It's conjuring up elements that are very unsettling, not only in the sound of the music, but just, I think, in the imagination. And then you get into the Ländler of the other movements, where it's the dance. You can hear the dance rhythms, you can feel a much more comfortable existence, a much more, perhaps even bourgeois existence. It's the Ländler, the dance, the waltz, which eventually came in. And then you've got that very emotional, beautiful fourth movement, which, I think conjures up many more visions of it's difficult to say, but love and romance. And I think the visual elements of Mahler, those are what I was thinking. And the more I listen to it, actually, the more I sort of see those pictures. And I think, I don't know, maybe it is fanciful, but I think people do find that there is just more to listening to the music in it. There's some visual imagination that the music inspires.